I Will Have You by Cowrie Fish. Chapter 1. A Refusal Refused. You could not have made me the offer of your hand in any possible way that would have tempted me to accept it. Elizabeth looked at Darcy as if challenging him to rebuke the intrinsic merit of her statements. He stared back at her no less bravely. You are mistaken, Miss Elizabeth, if you think that such will be the end of the matter. I will have you for my wife. Her absolute refusal to consider him fired him into a white heat of need. He could have never believed her so obstinate. His desire to make her accept him possessed him wholly. He had drawn quite close to where she stood with her back to one of the bookshelves, and grasped her hands in his. She started in outraged shock as he pinned her hands at her sides. His face was scant inches from her own, and so was she overwhelmed by his presence and faint odors of cologne, hoarse in his own self, that she could scarce listen to his words. Miss Elizabeth Bennet, will you agree to marry me? Her own pride rallied within her, and though she could not speak, shook her head vehemently. In that case you leave me no choice, for have you I will, he said, his eyes steadily fixed on hers. Darcy released her hands, turned swiftly, and exited the room. The sudden and total silence felt stifling, and Elizabeth shivered, as she felt a nebulous yet racking fear seize her. After a few moments, she tried to resume Jane's letter, but quickly let it fall back, now in the throes of a headache, this one quite real. Gravel crunched under Darcy's boots as he strode up to the doors of Rosings. Plans for a letter of explanation and perhaps another attempt swirled in his mind, and he barely had the presence to greet his cousin, who accosted him in the foyer, followed closely by Lady Catherine. Darcy tried to give his excuses, but Lady Catherine, smelling something afoot, sent Colonel Fitzwilliam back to the drawing-room with orders to serve tea to her guests from the parsonage, and took herself upstairs after her nephew. Darcy, his mind filled with words, scarce noticed his aunt's entrance to his study as he sat to begin the letter, which was swiftly snatched from under his pen. What is this, Fitzwilliam Darcy? Why are you writing to Miss Elizabeth Bennet? What could you have to say to that young woman? Darcy rose, angered. Would you please leave me? I have important business to attend to. I will not leave you until you explain to me why you are writing to Miss Bennet. Darcy stared at her icily. I am writing Miss Elizabeth Bennet because I am proposing marriage to her. Lady Catherine drew herself up in outrage. Propose marriage to Miss Bennet? That is impossible. How can you forget your engagement to Anne? Do you think you are a Turk to have two wives? You were already engaged, sir. At this she tore the paper in half. A white rage filled Darcy. I am not engaged to your daughter, madam. Your and my mother's intentions to the contrary. I have no intention of chaining myself to that unfortunate creature, and you would do well to make some other plans for her. As Lady Catherine stood, enraged and agape, Darcy seized his hat and fled the room. Darcy paused on his way to the servants' quarters to fetch his man. Elizabeth's fervent refusal haunted him. Her certainty, her strength of will, highlighted her disinterest. His fantasies about their life together, already strong, became doubly potent, the only reality that mattered. She was the only woman who could look him in the eye and see him for himself. Life without that would be a meaningless farce. Passion fired resolution, and he shot like the load from a cannon into action. He assured himself that the parson and his wife were still with his cousin in the drawing-room. Darcy hurried back to the rectory, closely followed by his valet and his groom. He had told them little, but that he was required to leave on a sudden trip. His air of command and their habits of obedience made the arrangements disarmingly simple. The servant again announced Mr. Darcy to Miss Bennet, and he entered the room swiftly and made his way to the window, where he announced curtly to someone out of Elizabeth's sight. He then turned to fix her with a wild gaze, then dropped his eyes and apologized softly, almost too softly for her to hear. Something in his air alarmed her greatly, and her decorum struggled with her outrage for the few moments that passed, before two men, Darcy's servants, burst into the room. Miss Bennet will be accompanying me on my journey, Darcy told them. They seized her. She began to struggle, but it was no use. Mr. Darcy, this is infamous, she cried, as they forced her from the room. Then one put his hand over her mouth to silence any further exclamations. Darcy followed, catching the eye of each servant who gathered at the scene. The housekeeper bravely stopped him just as they were about to quit the house. "Miss Bennet and I are going to Scotland," he told her, pressing a coin-filled pouch into her hand and looking meaningfully at her. She took measure of the bag in her hand, then curtsied deep. "Congratulations, my lord," she said. The carriage wheels clattered against the road. Elizabeth stared alternatingly at the passing countryside and at her new fiancé. Darcy divided his time between watching her and attending to various pieces of correspondence and other paperwork. Darcy had drafted a maid to pack her things. The woman had hastened under Darcy's imperious and ever so slightly panicked manner. In the carriage and under his supervision, she wrote the Collinses a letter, confessing that she and Mr. Darcy would culminate a secret engagement somewhere out of the country, and promised to write again after the marriage. As they drew nearer the coast, Elizabeth dully realized that the letter and other misdirection was meant to make them assume they were for Gretna Green, while in fact they were on the road to Portsmouth. Darcy addressed a letter and tucked it away. He looked up at her, then out the window. "We are very close to town now," he said earnestly. "There we will board a ship where I can offer you more comforts than this carriage. I'm afraid it will not be wise to stop before we reach the docks. I'm so sorry, this must be terribly shocking for you." His jaw moved as if to express more words, but his throat would not cooperate. Elizabeth fought a rising tide of tears with a brutal wash of anger. "How, Mr. Darcy, would you treat a man who had treated your sister as you have treated me? I may have no brothers to fight for me, but you can be assured that my father and my uncle will not take this injury lightly." Darcy scowled. "I would think you would prefer they never come to learn of it. What is done is done. It will mean nothing good for the relations between our families if you insist upon airing this matter." Elizabeth felt fury stab in her stomach and vitriol rise in her throat. "Can you truly believe that I will be silent, will say nothing of this kidnapping? You force me into an elopement that will shame my family and taint my sister's reputations, and expect that I will consent to be your silent wife? You are mistaken, sir. Your villainous conduct will be known if it is the last thing I do." Darcy's lips had grown thin, and his face flushed with anger as she berated him. That he had failed to think of her family in this mad rush to secure her stabbed at his conscience, undermining his confidence in his course of action, and the discomfort lent unwanted venom to his words. "Do you think you do yourself any favors, madam, by these rash threats? I have said what is done is done. Word, I am sure, of our elopement has already gone out by your cousin Mr. Collins' eager gossip. Would you return to Hertfordshire without me? Unwed? This is what would disgrace your family." He struggled to bring his temper under control. "Please, Elizabeth, be assured that I will do everything in my power to quench the rumors and make our union as respectable as possible. We will sail to Guernsey and be wed at St. Peter's Port. I have already written to Bingley to encourage him to renew his addresses to your sister Jane. I will spend the rest of my life in making up for today to you. Please, cannot you at least consider thinking of forgiving me?" Elizabeth turned her face away and stared out the window. "I will never forgive you."